Welcome back to Western Hearts and Old Times. Settle in, and let me tell you a story about loss, courage, and the fragile moments that change a life forever. In the early 1870s, in the southern reaches of Arizona Territory near the Mexican border, the land was wide and unforgiving. Mercy was something people spoke of more often than they practiced. The law here was thin as dust. Men with money bent it. Men without it disappeared beneath it. Norah understood that balance well enough to keep her head down and her words few. Silence was not peace. It was a kind of armor for a woman alone. Silence was sometimes the only thing that kept trouble from noticing you. Norah lived on a small, weather-beaten ranch at the edge of nowhere. Once, it had been a family place. Once, there had been laughter, a child's footsteps, a future that felt solid enough to lean on. That life had ended quietly, the way many things did out here through sickness, exhaustion, and the slow erosion of hope. Norah had once been a wife. She had once been a mother. Both of those truths had ended in the same year. What remained was Norah, the land, and a grief she carried without witnesses. Most days passed the same way: work, heat, stillness, in the careful habit of not being seen too much. People in town said she was strong for staying. Norah knew better. Staying was easier than going anywhere else when everything meaningful had already been buried. So when the sheriff mentioned a dead steer and whispered rumors of an Apache child seen in the dark, she listened but said nothing. Norah Finch did not know it yet, but by nightfall, silence would no longer protect her. When she first arrived in southern Arizona, newly married and still thin with hope, she believed what Clayton told her, that hard work could tame even the most stubborn soil. That isolation was a fair price for independence. That a family could grow anywhere as long as there was space and sky enough to hold it. Back then, the ranch had felt like a beginning, a place where mornings smelled of dust and promise, and nights were filled with plans whispered between two people who still believed the future could be shaped by their hands. That belief did not survive the land. The heat came first, relentless and dry. It pressed down on the body until even breathing felt like effort. Then came the sickness. It moved through the scattered settlements without warning, carried by water that looked clean and air that felt harmless. Norah remembered the way her son's skin burned beneath her palms, the way his small chest struggled against breaths that would not come easily. She remembered praying for strength, for mercy, for time. None of it had mattered. The land did not listen after the child died. Clayton changed in ways Norah did not recognize at first. He grew quieter, then sharper. He stopped touching anything that reminded him of the boy, the small boots by the door, the wooden horse carved from scrap. Even the blanket Norah refused to move. Grief hollowed him out. But instead of staying to fill that hollow together, he turned away from it. One morning, he saddled the horse and told her that he needed air. By nightfall, he was gone. He never came back. Norah did not cry when she realized he would not return. There were no tears left for him. What remained was a numb resolve to keep breathing, to keep the land fed, even if it gave nothing back. She learned to fix broken hinges, to stretch meals longer than they should last, to sit with the quiet without letting it swallow her whole. Most days passed without conversation. Weeks blurred into months. The only voice that regularly crossed her threshold belonged to Sheriff Edward Mallory. He came not as an officer chasing trouble, but as a man who understood how easily people like Norah could be forgotten. He never overstayed, never pried. He would stand on the porch, hat in hand, and ask after the well, the fences, the weather. Sometimes he brought news. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. The knock came just after sunrise. Norah was rinsing a tin cup at the basin when she heard it 3 measured taps, neither hurried nor soft. She did not startle. There were only a handful of men who knocked like that anymore, and only one who did it out of habit rather than necessity. She dried her hands on her skirt and opened the door. Sheriff Edward Mallory stood on the porch. His face looked older than it had the last time she'd seen him, as though the land itself had added another year overnight. He did not enter. Instead, he leaned a shoulder against the post and exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath since town. "Beaumont's raising hell," he said at last. "One of his steers was killed in the night. Arrow left in it, plain as day." It had been found on land claimed by Harlan Beaumont, the wealthiest cattle owner for miles around. A single animal lost meant little to a man like Beaumont, but the way it had been killed mattered. Norah felt something tighten in her chest, though she kept her face still. "They say it was a child," Mallory went on. "Apache, young enough to run when he should have hidden." Mallory looked at her, then not sharply, not accusingly, but with the careful attention of a man who knew how easily a life could be tipped off balance. "People are uneasy," Mallory said. "They're talking. Talk traveled faster than truth out here. Rumors hardened quickly, and once they did, no amount of explanation could soften them again." "Did you see anything?" Mallory asked, his tone neutral. She shook her head. It was the truth. She had seen nothing, heard nothing, but the way his eyes lingered told her he was not asking only for information. He was asking her to be cautious. After he left, Norah stood alone in the doorway longer than necessary, staring out at the open land. The wind moved through the grass in slow waves, hiding and revealing what lay beneath it. She thought of Beaumont's men, of their rifles and horses, of how quickly anger could turn into something worse when fed by fear and pride. She had learned long ago that in places like this, innocence was useless. The rest of the day passed in the rhythm she knew well. She worked without thinking, letting habit carry her through tasks that no longer required conscious effort. It was only when she moved toward the barn, intending to gather hay before the sun dropped lower, that something felt wrong, a shift in the air that made her slow her steps. She paused at the barn door, hand resting against the rough wood, for reasons she could not name. That was when she saw the hay disturbed. Not enough to suggest an animal, not enough to draw attention unless one was already looking. But Norah had learned how little it took for something fragile to be broken. She stood very still, heart beating loud in her ears, the sheriff's words echoing faintly in her mind. A dead steer, an Apache child, unease spreading like dry brush fire, whatever waited inside the barn. She understood one thing with sudden clarity. The silence she had built her life around was about to end. Norah did not call out. She had learned, over years of living alone, that calling attention to oneself was rarely wise. Instead, she stood just inside the barn, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light and her breathing slow enough that she could hear what the space was telling her. The smell of dry hay and old wood filled her lungs. Somewhere outside, a bird cried and then went quiet again. The disturbed hay lay near the back wall, close to where Clayton used to stack bales before he left. At first glance, it looked like nothing, just a slippage. The kind that happened when a careless fork struck too deep. But Norah knew her own work. She had not been careless today. She took one step forward, then another. With each step, the memory of Sheriff Mallory's voice returned, uninvited and insistent. An arrow, a child's shadow, people talking. The words layered themselves over the present until past and present blurred together, making her chest tighten in a way she had not felt since the worst days of her son's illness. When she reached the pile, she stopped again. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then she saw it, the faintest shift, the slightest rise and fall beneath the hay. Not an animal's rhythm, too controlled, too careful. Norah swallowed, her hands trembled, though she did not yet know why. She crouched slowly and pushed aside a thin layer of hay with the back of her fingers, moving gently, as if afraid the motion itself might shatter whatever fragile balance held the moment together. The eyes appeared first, dark, wide, watching her with a stillness that felt practiced rather than instinctive. The face that followed was thin, dust-streaked, far too young to carry the weight it clearly already bore. A boy, no more than 14 by her guess, curled tightly into himself as if trying to take up as little space as possible. They stared at one another. Neither spoke, neither moved. In that silence, Norah felt time stretch, thin and brittle. The barn faded away, replaced by a different room, a smaller bed, a child's face flushed with fever. She smelled sickness instead of hay, heard shallow breathing instead of her own pulse. The past rose up with a force that stole the strength from her legs. If my son had lived, her mind whispered, unbidden, he would be this age. The thought struck so hard she nearly lost her balance. She braced herself against the wooden beam, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them again, the boy had not moved. His gaze followed her every breath, every shift of weight, as if ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Behind her eyes, another voice layered itself over the memory. Did you see anything? People are uneasy. A child. Sheriff Mallory's words echoed not as sound, but as pressure. Norah understood, in that moment, that whatever choice she made next would not belong to the barn alone. It would reach beyond it to the town, to the land, to consequences she could not yet see. She exhaled slowly and forced herself to soften her posture. She lowered herself to one knee, keeping her movements deliberate and small. "You're hurt?" she asked quietly. The boy flinched at the sound of her voice, but he did not run. After a moment's hesitation, he shook his head once. The motion was slight, almost imperceptible, but it loosened something in her chest she had not realized was locked. Norah nodded, as if they had agreed on something important. She glanced toward the barn door, half expecting to see figures silhouetted against the light, rifles slung casually over shoulders. The doorway remained empty, for now. "Come with me," she said, her voice steady despite the storm gathering beneath it. "It's not safe here." She did not reach for him. She turned away first, taking 2 steps toward the house before stopping to see if he would follow. For a heartbeat, she thought he would not. Then she heard the soft rustle of hay behind her. When she looked back, the boy was on his feet, keeping a careful distance, his movements quiet and tense. He followed her out of the barn like a shadow, eyes darting at every sound, every open stretch of ground. Norah led him inside the house through the back door, closing it quickly behind them. The familiar interior felt suddenly different, smaller, more exposed, no longer hers alone. She drew the curtains and motioned him toward the narrow space behind the old cupboard where the light did not reach. "Stay there," she said gently. "I'll get you something to eat." The boy hesitated, then obeyed. As Norah moved toward the stove, her hands shaking as she reached for bread and water, a realization settled over her with quiet finality. She had done something that could never be undone. Norah's journey is only beginning. If you're curious to see where her path leads next, stay with me and share your thoughts. Tell me where you're listening from. And thank you for being here. Norah waited until the boy's breathing slowed before she allowed herself to move freely again. He sat tucked into the narrow space behind the cupboard, knees drawn up, shoulders hunched forward as if expecting the walls themselves to turn against him. The small lamp on the table cast only a faint glow, and she was careful not to lift it. Light, she knew, could betray as easily as sound. She tore the bread into smaller pieces before setting it beside a tin cup of water. When she slid the plate toward him, he stared at it for several seconds as though uncertain it was real. Only when she stepped back did he reach for it, his hands quick and guarded, like an animal accustomed to having food snatched away. Norah sat at the table, keeping her eyes lowered, giving him the dignity of privacy. She listened instead to the scrape of bread against enamel, to the careful swallows, to the way he paused between bites as if memorizing the taste. After a while, she spoke again, keeping her words simple. "Your name?" He hesitated, then answered softly, "Sani." The sound of it settled gently into the room. Norah repeated it once, testing its shape on her tongue, then nodded. He spoke little after that. What English he had came in fragments, strung together with long pauses, but she understood enough. He had gone out alone. He had wanted to prove something to himself, to his people, to his father. When he fired the arrow, he had felt pride until he saw the men, the guns, the torches. Fear had taken him faster than thought. Norah closed her eyes briefly as he spoke. She could picture it too easily, a boy standing on the edge of manhood, mistaking danger for courage, learning too late that the world did not forgive such mistakes. When he finished, silence returned, heavier than before. Norah stood and began to clear the table, more for the comfort of motion than necessity. Each sound felt louder now. Each creak of the floorboards set her nerves on edge. She found herself glancing toward the windows, half expecting shadows to appear where there had been none before. The knock came late in the afternoon. 3 light taps on the door, familiar, unhurried. Norah's stomach tightened. She turned toward the cupboard. Sani had already stiffened, eyes wide, his body pressing further back into the shadows. She lifted a finger to her lips and nodded toward the far corner. He did not need to be told twice. She opened the door only part way. Mrs. Hawkins stood on the porch, hands folded over her apron, her expression bright with the peculiar energy of a woman who had finished her chores and was hungry for conversation. She leaned forward slightly, peering past Norah's shoulder before catching herself and smiling. "Thought I'd check on you," she said. "Town's been restless today." Norah stepped outside and closed the door behind her. Mrs. Hawkins wasted no time. She spoke of Beaumont's temper, of men riding out in pairs along the road, of talk that carried sharper edges than usual. She spoke of danger as though it were weather unpleasant, unavoidable, and best discussed before it arrived. Norah listened, nodding at the right moments, offering little in return. Her mind stayed inside the house, counting the seconds, listening for any sound that might carry through the door. Mrs. Hawkins paused mid-sentence, her eyes drifting. Didn't expect you to be eating already, she said lightly. Saw the table through the window. Or do you have company? The question struck hard and sudden. For an instant, Norah felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, threatening to steal her breath. She forced herself not to look back at the door, forced her hands to remain still at her sides. I missed my noon meal, she said, her voice even. Happens sometimes. Mrs. Hawkins studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, satisfied. She launched into another thread of gossip, already moving on, already forgetting. When she finally left, Norah remained on the porch long after the sound of her footsteps faded. Only when the air felt empty again did she return inside and lock the door. The house felt different now, as though the walls themselves were listening. That night, Norah lay awake on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of fabric as Sonny shifted in his sleep. The distant howl of a coyote, the wind brushing against the shutters. Her thoughts spun relentlessly, circling the same questions she refused to answer aloud. Sleep never came. By morning, Norah Finch understood one thing with painful clarity. The land had already taken her child. She would not let it take another. Sheriff Edward Mallory arrived just after sunrise. Norah saw him from the kitchen window before she heard the knock, his horse moving slowly along the fence line, his posture stiff with the weight of a man who had slept little and thought too much. She told Sonny to stay where he was. He nodded, eyes alert now, already learning the rules of fear that govern this land. Norah opened the door. Edward stepped inside without ceremony, removing his hat as he always did. For a moment, he spoke of ordinary things, the heat coming early this year, Beaumont's men riding farther out than usual, the way trouble had a habit of breeding more trouble if left unattended. His voice was calm, but his eyes were not. They moved through the room, careful, measuring. Norah felt his attention brush against the corners of the house like a hand testing weak boards. Then it happened. His gaze stopped just a moment too long at the cupboard. Instinct took over before thought. Edward's hand went to his holster, the movement smooth from decades of habit. The gun was out, raised, its dark mouth aimed toward the narrow space where Sonny hid. "Come out," Edward said, his voice firm, not unkind, slowly. Sonny did not move. Norah moved instead. She crossed the room in 2 steps and caught Edward's arm, pulling it down with a strength she did not know she still possessed. "No," she said, her voice breaking through the room like a snapped wire. "Please, put it down." For a heartbeat. Edward resisted, then his eyes met hers, and the tension shifted. The gun lowered. He exhaled and returned it to the holster as though ashamed of how quickly it had come to hand. Sonny emerged on his own then, small and rigid, his fear plain. Edward studied him quietly, not as a threat, not even as a suspect, but as a child who had wandered into a world that did not belong to him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Edward asked quietly. Norah swallowed. "Look at him," she said. "If my son had lived, he'd be this age." Edward's jaw tightened. "If they find him," she continued, "there won't be a trial. There won't be mercy. You know that." Edward turned away, staring at the wall as if it might offer answers. When he spoke again, his voice was low and grave. "What's your plan, Norah?" he asked. "You can't keep him here, not with Beaumont breathing down everyone's neck." The question landed hard. Norah opened her mouth and found nothing there. No plan, no future. Only the instinct that had carried her this far. Edward nodded. as if her silence told him everything he needed to know. Then he said the thing that broke her. "You have to leave today." Norah stared at him. "It won't matter who comes first." Edward went on. "Beaumont's men, or Clayton. If he gets wind of trouble and comes sniffing around for land that still has his name tied to it. Either way, you'll lose the ranch. And if you fight it," he shook his head, "I've seen what happens to women who stand alone out here." His eyes softened. "Just a little. Pack what you can carry. Take the boy. Get him back to his people, and don't come back." "What about you?" Norah asked. Edward placed his hat back on his head. "I'll give you time," he said. "It's the last thing I can ever offer you." She did not argue. Norah packed quickly bread, water, a blanket, the knife Clayton had left behind. She took one last look at the house, at the walls that had held her grief without judgment, and closed the door behind her, as she and Sonny disappeared into the brush. Edward remained where he was, waiting. Moments later, the sound of voices and hooves filled the road. By the time Beaumont's men reached the ranch, it was already empty, and Norah Finch was gone. Norah did not stop walking until her lungs burned. The path Edward had pointed out wound away from the ranch in a series of shallow bends, cutting through scrub and stone rather than following the open road. It was slower going, but safer, or at least it was meant to be. Norah kept her hand wrapped tightly around Sonny's wrist, guiding him when the ground dropped unexpectedly or when thorny brush snagged at his clothes. They walked quietly. Making any sound felt like a risk, as if even breathing too loudly might give them away. Only when the sun dipped low and shadows began to stretch across the land did Norah feel the first true tremor of fear. It started as a sensation rather than a thought. The hairs at the back of her neck prickled. Her steps slowed without her willing them to. She glanced over her shoulder and saw nothing but empty space and fading light. Yet the feeling did not pass. She walked faster as darkness crept in. The world around them transformed. Familiar shapes lost their certainty. Rocks became crouching figures. Bushes shifted into silhouettes that seemed to lean toward them. Once, she was certain she saw the flicker of flame far behind them, just a brief pulse of orange against the deepening blue of dusk. She stopped abruptly. Sonny nearly collided with her back. He followed her gaze, his small body going rigid. He did not speak, but his grip tightened. "I don't know if it's real," Norah whispered, more to herself than to him. "Or if I'm imagining it." The words tasted hollow. Fear had a way of inventing its own truths. They pressed on into full darkness, moving now without the benefit of sight, relying on instinct and the uneven guidance of the stars. Norah forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, counting each step as a way to keep panic from overtaking reason. Still, the sensation of being watched clung to her like heat. By the time the moon rose, pale and thin, her legs shook with exhaustion. That was when it happened. A hand seized her arm from the darkness, large, unyielding, clamping down with a strength that stole the air from her chest. She was dragged backward, her cry strangled before it could escape. Another arm locked around her shoulders, pinning her in place. Norah's mind went blank. Edward's warnings, Beaumont's men, Clayton's name, everything crashed together in a single surge of terror. She clawed uselessly at the grip, her nails scraping against rough fabric, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Then Sonny's voice cut through the night. "Father," the word rang out sharp and clear, filled not with fear, but recognition. The grip on Norah loosened instantly. The arms released her as though she had turned to smoke. She stumbled forward, barely catching herself before falling. When she turned, she saw the man standing there tall, broad-shouldered, his presence solid and unmistakably real. Sonny ran to him without hesitation, pressing himself against the man's side. The man's hands came down on the boy's shoulders, firm and grounding, his head bowing briefly as if in silent thanks. Only then did he look at Norah. His face was weathered and darkened by the sun, his eyes steady and assessing. There was no anger there, no accusation, only urgency. "We must move," he said in careful English. "Now." Norah nodded, her heart still hammering too hard to trust her voice. He led them away from the path, guiding them along the base of a low rock wall until they reached a narrow break in the stone. Beyond it lay a shallow hollow, hidden from view, shielded from the wind. The man knelt and began to work quickly, clearing a small space, arranging stones with practiced efficiency. When he struck the flint, the fire he coaxed to life was small and controlled, its glow barely visible beyond the rock. Only when they were seated, only when the flames steadied. Did Norah realize her hands were still shaking? The man watched her carefully, then spoke again. "I am Dakai Nochi," he said. "Sonny is my son." The fire crackled softly. No higher than Dakai allowed it to rise. Its light flickered across the stone, across Sonny's drawn face, across the lines carved into Dakai's features by years of sun and watching. Norah sat with her back against the rock wall, her knees pulled close, the chill of the night finally seeping through her clothes now that fear no longer drove her forward. For a long while, no one spoke. Sonny was the first to break the silence. He stared into the fire as if it might judge him, then lifted his eyes to his father. "I wanted you to see me," he said. "I wanted to come back, not a child." Dakai closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the anger Norah had expected was not there, only exhaustion, and something gentler beneath it. "I saw your tracks," he said quietly. "Every day. I followed them until they disappeared. Then I followed the places where you might have gone." He paused, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "You do not become a warrior by walking alone. You become one by knowing when not to." Sonny nodded, his chin dipping toward his chest. He did not argue. The fire popped, sending a brief spray of sparks upward. Norah found herself watching Dakai's hands, how carefully he tended the flames, how every movement was measured, deliberate. This was a man accustomed to watching over things that could easily be lost. "I found your ranch," Dakai said at last, turning his gaze to her. "Days ago, there were men riding near it. I did not go closer." Norah's breath caught. "You were there." "Yes." His voice carried no accusation. "I waited. I watched. When you left, I followed behind. I erased the signs as best I could." She swallowed, the weight of his words settling over her. She had thought herself alone in those final moments, unseen, unguarded. The truth was both humbling and strangely comforting. Dakai stared into the fire again before continuing. "Sonny's mother died after his birth," he said. "Her body grew weak. She stayed longer than she should have." His jaw tightened. She lived until he no longer needed her milk. Then she was gone. Norah felt something inside her shift. "I could not save her," Dakai said simply. "That knowledge does not leave a man." Norah understood that sentence more deeply than she wanted to. The words slipped from her before she could stop them. "My son died of sickness," she said. I watched it take him, day by day. I prayed, I worked, I did everything I knew how. Her voice wavered, then steadied. It didn't matter. Dakai turned toward her fully now. The firelight caught in his eyes, reflecting something unspoken. They did not say the names of their dead. They did not need to. The silence that followed was different from the others, less heavy, more deliberate. It carried recognition, not pity, not obligation, something quieter and more enduring. Sani shifted closer to the fire, his head leaning against his father's arm. Within minutes, sleep claimed him, the hard edge of fear finally dulled by safety. Norah watched the boy's chest rise and fall. In the steady rhythm of his breathing, she felt the echo of something she had not allowed herself to feel in years: belonging. Dakai stood and added another small piece of wood to the fire, then sat again, this time closer to Norah. "You did not have to do what you did," he said. "You risked everything for him." She looked at her hands. "I didn't think about it. I just couldn't leave him." Dakai nodded slowly. "That is how we know who we are." The fire burned lower as the night deepened. Above them, the sky stretched wide and indifferent. Stars scattered like witnesses who would never speak. Yet there, in that hidden hollow, something had been spoken all the same. 3 lives, broken in different ways, had found one another in the dark, and none of them were entirely alone anymore. Dawn arrived quietly. It did not announce itself with light at first, but with a thinning of shadows, a soft easing of the night's grip. Norah woke to the sound of wind moving gently across stone and grass, carrying with it the scent of earth warming after darkness. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then she felt the rock at her back, the cool air on her face, and the steady presence of the fire's dying embers. Sani still slept, curled close to his father, his breathing deep and untroubled. Dakai was awake, standing a short distance away, watching the horizon with the stillness of someone who had learned patience from the land itself. The sky slowly lightened, revealing the wide expanse below the ridge. From this height, the world looked untouched. No fences, no roads, no signs of men searching, judging, claiming. Just land, stretching endlessly in all directions. Norah rose carefully, her joints stiff, her body reminding her of how much she had carried in the last 2 days. Dakai turned at the sound of her movement. "This is the hour when men begin to look," he said softly. "We should go soon." She nodded. The word "go" settled into her with a strange calm. For the first time since leaving the ranch, she did not feel the pull of what lay behind her. There was nothing there that still belonged to her. Not the house, not the land, not even the life she had once tried to build. Only memory remained. Dakai hesitated, then spoke again. "This is the first time I have stood before you," he said. "But you have already done more for my son than many would do for their own blood." He met her eyes fully now. "I will not leave you to walk alone. I ask to travel with you for his sake, and for yours, so that you do not have to face the road alone." Norah felt the weight of his words not as a burden, but as an offering. She thought of the ranch, of Sheriff Mallory standing alone to buy her time. She thought of Mrs. Hawkins and her harmless questions, of the town that would soon forget her name. She thought of the small grave beneath the cottonwoods, and of the life that had ended there. "I don't know where I'm going," she said honestly. Dakai inclined his head. "Then we will discover it as we walk." Sani stirred then, blinking awake. his eyes brightening when he saw both of them standing together. He rose quickly, dusting himself off, already lighter than he had been days before. They did not speak of love. They did not speak of promises. Those things belong to later days, to trust built slowly, step by step. What passed between them now was simpler and stronger for it. Choice. They set out as the sun crested the horizon, three figures moving down from the rocks and into the open land. Norah walked beside Dakai, not behind him, her pace matching his without effort. Sani moved ahead, pointing out tracks and birds, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. As the distance grew between them and the place she had once called home, Norah felt something loosen inside her chest. Not grief, it would always be there, but its sharpest edge had dulled. She had not found safety by hiding. She had found it by choosing to act, by choosing to care, by choosing to walk forward, even when the path was uncertain. And as the light spread across the land, Norah Finch understood that this was not an ending at all. It was the beginning of a life shaped not by what she had lost, but by what she was still willing to protect. In time, others would claim her ranch, argue over its boundaries, and forget the woman who used to live there with her grief. The house would weather and lean, the fields would change hands, and the small grave beneath the cottonwoods would be known only to the wind. That was the way of the frontier. Norah had lost a son. She had lost a home, but she had fought for something just as important. The knowledge that her life still mattered because she chose to make it matter to others. The lesson of this story was simple, but costly sometimes. The bravest act is not survival at all, but choosing compassion in a world that profits from cruelty.